Hello, kind traveler, and welcome to the Mischievous Mare. I am your host and weaver of tales, Vintr Bjorn. Today I will be reading for you Chapter 2 of my friend Katherine's book, Red Clay Dust. Now, without further ado, I hope you enjoy. Chapter 2 Naming. The ancient lore tells of the history of a time when all the land was covered in darkness and shadow. The legend of Valerie. He opened his eyes groggily. His vision was blurry, and the only thing he was aware of was a bone-weary exhaustion. Every muscle felt weak and shaky. His skin felt hot and clammy, and yet he felt cold. He was covered in sweat, and the sheets around him were soaked with it. His vision slowly came into focus, and he felt a pang of concern as he didn't recognize his surroundings. Where was he? How had he gotten here? Where had his clothes gone? In a panic, he tried to rise, but his muscles refused to obey. "Calm yourself, hon," a gentle voice said. He stilled as a soft hand touched his shoulder. He rolled his head to see a woman standing beside the bed. How, by the high heavens and the depths of the earth, had he missed her? Her silky blonde hair tumbled out from under her white bonnet like liquid starlight, and her emerald green eyes sparkled like the first light of dawn through the leaves. Her skin was pale and flawless, and her cheeks blushed a pretty shade of pink. She was a beauty to behold. He suddenly felt a strange sense of nostalgia, as if he should know who she was, and yet could not recall it. She also made him very aware he was missing his clothes. He was glad that he hadn't thrown off the sheets in his earlier panic, although he was sure that she could see the results of her beauty. "You're all right. You came into town yesterday," she continued, those eyes watching him with such worry that he felt a sharp pang in his heart. "Do you remember anything? I'm Rhea, the baker's wife. We took you in." He stared at her blankly. He struggled to remember what she was speaking of, but his mind refused. He didn't remember coming into town, or even what town he was in. He didn't remember where he had come from. He could not even remember who he was. His lips felt swollen and ungainly, and his throat rasped as he tried to speak. "No." She looked at him disbelievingly for a moment, then her face fell. Clearly, that was not the answer she had been expecting. It was only a moment before she composed herself again and smiled gently at him, tutting sympathetically. "The fever addled your memory. Do you know your name?" "No." He was beginning to feel more and more distressed. Who was he? How could he not know? How could his entire life be gone without any kind of recollection? How old was he? Where was he from? He tried to sit up again, reaching for her shoulder to support him. Who am I? Why can't I remember anything? What happened?" "Shh." Rhea gently pushed him back down. He was dismayed to find that he didn't even have the strength to resist her light touch. She patted his shoulder comfortingly. "You're safe here." He watched her as she turned and handed him a tray with bread, soup, and a cup of water that had been sitting on the windowsill close to the bed. He found himself following how flowing her movements were. Everything she did was possessed of some kind of alien grace. Surely she couldn't be just a simple housewife. She looked like she belonged in a great hall in a tailored gown bedecked with gold and jewels and the finest of furs, not in a dank house in a little town. He felt his cheek flush red again at the thought of how much the sheet was revealing to her, but she paid no mind and continued about her task. He pulled his arms out from under the sheet that was covering him, being careful to make sure he remained covered, and took the bread. Rhea held the tray patiently and settled herself in a chair next to the bed. For the first time since he had opened his eyes, he looked around the room. It was small and simple. Whitewashed walls caught and reflected the sunlight from outside, making the room bright without having to have any candles lit. There was a simple table beside the bed with a shallow basin and a water pitcher set on it. In the corner was a small desk with a few scattered parchments. Rhea followed his gaze. Her calm manner was suddenly ruffled, and she hurried over to the desk, snatching up the parchment and stuffing them inside a drawer in the desk. She made sure that it was locked before she turned and her calm demeanor returned. "Now, I can tell you what I do know," she said as she watched him. He took a cautious bite of bread under her watchful gaze, wary of what could have been so private to hide in such a hurry from him. "You rode into town yesterday. You stopped here and fell off your horse. You had a fever that you were lucky broke sometime last night. Otherwise, you might not have made it through the night." He could only stare at her as what she said sank in. He could have died. How could he not remember something like that? What had happened to him? "I have a horse?" "Yes," Rhea replied gently, seeming amused that of all she had told him, his horse was what he questioned her about. She stared at him for a moment. "You have no memory at all?" "No." He croaked in answer. His whole life was gone. Who was he? He took a small bite of bread and chewed slowly. His jaw muscles ached and burned in protest of the effort. His stomach rumbled as he realized how hungry he was. When was the last time he'd eaten? Rhea helped him to sit up. The muscles in his arms and back quivered with protest. He leaned back against the headboard of the bed with relief and blew out a long, exhausted breath. Even without his memory, he knew that he had never felt so weak before. He could have despised it, but he was too tired to even do that. His hands shook frightfully as he managed to eat the thin chicken soup that Rhea was holding for him. He drained the last of the soup from the bowl, leaned his head back against the headboard, and closed his eyes, weary but grateful. Rhea took the bowl from him and gently put the cup of water in his hands. He drank greedily, feeling it soothe his parched throat. After the meal, his eyelids began to grow heavy. He felt exhausted, and all he had done was sit up and eat. "Rest again now." Rhea began to put the dishes back on the tray and shuffle towards the door. "Try to regain some of your strength. You might remember something when you wake up." He slowly slid back down in the bed, allowing the exhaustion to take him. Rhea hummed a quiet lullaby as she carried the empty dishes out of the room. He admired her beauty once again before he sank back into oblivion, dreaming of being tangled in the velvet veil of her beauty. The stranger slept through the rest of the day and the night. Rhea and her husband Halen, the baker, discussed the stranger and what his arrival meant for the little town. The rain had come with him that had been such a blessing was now a curse. The rain had fallen too fast and too hard, flooding fields of crops. Farmers would be lucky if they could salvage any of the harvest. Now that they knew that he had lost his memory, both of them were more than a little perturbed. He was a sign for a new beginning, but he was also a challenge that they had not expected. The stranger had the chance to reinvent himself as anyone he wanted, and they would be there to aid him. Halen was not convinced, but he trusted Rhea's judgment and agreed to remain silent around the stranger about their conversation. When the stranger awoke, he found a man in the room instead of Rhea. He was a large man, beefy and broad. His brown hair was kept short out of the way of his brown eyes. His apron was covered in flour, as were his breeches. His shirt sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, and the muscles in his forearms stood out starkly. Judging from his appearance, the stranger guessed that this was Rhea's husband. The stranger wondered how a baker could have built up such a physique, but he kept that question to himself. "Welcome back to the land of the living." There was a wry note in the baker's voice. You've been through quite an ordeal. Hungry? The stranger nodded, slowly. Very. I thought you might be. The baker smacked his knee with his hand and stood. Well then, I've just been working on a fresh batch of bread with a new recipe. You can be the first to try it. Rhea also just made some tomato soup. I love that stuff. That woman is the best damn cook I've ever met. The stranger chuckled. Lucky you. Oh, I am. I'm a very lucky man, Baker agreed jovially. Suddenly his expression grew serious and his eyes narrowed. I am. Rhea is my life and love. She means the world to me. Well, I suppose the food's in the kitchen. The stranger started to get up. He forced the muscles in his arms to work and push himself up to sit. He felt his arms begin to shake, and he had to catch his breath from the exertion. But he refused to give up in front of the baker. His encounter with Rhea and discovering that he had no memory of his life had unnerved him enough. He felt like he needed to prove to the baker that he would not be trouble. He refused to lie around if he did not have to. His pride would not allow him. The baker raised an eyebrow as the stranger heaved in air. You sure you're up for this? The stranger took a deep breath, then swung his legs over the edge of the bed. He felt like a newborn colt. His legs were shaky and unsteady. He felt as if his knees were made of water. Lights flashed across his eyes, and he could feel every muscle in his body struggling to comply. I've never liked lying around. I do remember that. You don't remember much, do you? The baker asked as he handed the stranger his breeches. There was a note of sympathy in his voice that drove the stranger even harder to manage without aid. He felt like he was going to pass out again as he pulled his breeches on. No, I don't know who I am or who I was. I don't even remember coming here. Well, a man needs a name, the baker decided. He reached out and helped the stranger to his feet. My name is Halen. The world was spinning. The stranger felt like he was going to collapse at any second. Halen kept a firm grip on his arm, giving him a blessed point to brace himself against. He gripped Halen's shoulder feebly, struggling to bring his body back under his own control. Sit down, Halen ordered. You're going to fall. We'll bring you the food. Sit down, and we'll see if we can't find you a name you like. You're going to name me? The stranger repeated incredulously. Even in his dizzy stupor, the idea galled him. No, you're going to pick a name, Halen explained. We have to call you something. Now, for heaven's sake, sit down, you bloody fool. The stranger was grateful as Halen lowered him back down on the bed, although he would not admit it. He half laid, half fell back on the bed, gasping in deep breaths of air and trying not to fall into unconsciousness again. His vision swam as he tried to watch Halen leave. The baker returned a few minutes later with a tray laden with bread, soup, cheese, and a cup of water. He shakily ate the meager meal. Despite Halen's glowing description of Rhea's soup that she was cooking, he realized that this was leftover chicken soup from the day before. They probably had not wanted to risk overwhelming his stomach. It was satisfying all the same, even though there was barely any in the bowl. Once all the food was gone, he leaned back against the pillow with a satisfied sigh. He felt exhausted still, but not nearly as bad as the day before. So how was it? Halen asked. The finest meal I've ever tasted, the stranger replied, not entirely lying. Halen gave a deep booming laugh. Well, he's got a sense of humor now. Good on you. Now, on to what we'll call you. Halen looked thoughtful for a moment. How about Conley? The stranger shook his head. Was Halen just going to hurl random names at him until he just chose one? Already he could see that this was not going to work. He did not want just a random name. He wanted his name. He was trying to recall even a sound from it, but nothing was coming to him. Still, he knew Conley couldn't be anywhere close. I don't remember it sounding like that. Halen grimaced. Alright. How about loaning? Again, the stranger shook his head. Already he feared this would go on forever. Lorcan? That sounds closer, the stranger replied, sitting up a little. The name had sparked something in him. He could feel it vaguely, like it was just out of grasp. Something about the name had given him a jolt before slipping back into the void. Daman? Halen tried again. There was a look in his eye that the stranger couldn't quite decipher, almost as if he were playing a game. Perhaps to Halen this was all a game, but not to the stranger. No, it was the R. His gut told him that Halen knew something that he didn't, but of course that was true. He couldn't even recall how he had come to this place, or even what he looked like. It would be no surprise at all that Halen knew things that he didn't. It was something with an R. I'm sure of it. Halen looked thoughtful again for a moment. He looked as though he were reading the stranger, his eyes following every line and mark on his face. It was as if somehow he thought he would find the answer staring back at him. How about Doric? The stranger thought for a moment. The name stirred something in him, something more than the other name before had. He didn't know if this was truly his name, but it felt right. He felt like it belonged to him. There was an uncomfortable jolt as he realized that he might never know his real name. I like that one. Well, good. There you are, Halen pronounced, slapping his knee in satisfaction. Doric, that be your name now. Doric stared at the ceiling as he thought about the name. He wondered if it was right to decide on a name again so soon after he'd woken up, especially when he could remember his real name at any time. He knew that Halen was right. He needed something to be called by. He shifted uncomfortably as the same terrible thought from earlier struck him again. What if he never remembered his real name? What if he never remembered who he was? Now that that's settled, and you've settled a bit, you feel up to trying again? I know that you just ate, but I imagine that you're probably still hungry. Halen plowed on. I promise Rhea's new batch of soup be worth it. Doric took a deep breath and tried to sit up again. It still took a fair amount of strain, but he had already done it once. He set his feet on the floor and pushed himself up unsteadily. His legs trembled and he still felt like his knees were made of naught but water. He leaned heavily on the bed and his knees began to give out from under him. Halen caught him and slung Doric's arm over his shoulders. Doric nodded to him and Halen grunted in acknowledgement. Doric only kept himself up with Halen's help as he shuffled out of the bedroom to the kitchen where Rhea was cooking. His legs were shaking and he knew that if Halen were to let him go, he would fall. The smell of Rhea's cooking alone as they made their way through the rest of the house was worth it. What on earth is he doing up? He should be resting. What, Halen? Rhea exclaimed as she turned from her stew pot, wielding her soup spoon threateningly at the two men. Oh, he be fine. Halen helped Doric lower himself down into a chair. The burly baker carefully kept Doric between himself and his wife, just in case she made good on attacking with the wooden spoon. Doric sighed gratefully for the rest, his head lulled back, and he took deep breaths to steady himself. While I'm out here, I might as well get something to eat. Rhea glared at her husband as he snickered. She continued to glare while she ladled soup into a bowl for Doric. She set it down lightly in front of him and patted his shoulder. You should be back in bed so you can get your strength back. It was only a fever, Doric replied as he forced himself to sit upright. He reached shakily for a spoon and began to eat. Immediately, the soup was a burst of flavor in his mouth. It was sweet and tangy, with a few spices that gave it a sharp edge. Doric paused for a moment in surprise to savor it. Rhea, there's no need to worry, Halen said as she handed him a bowl of soup too. That man be fine so long as he can get some of your wonderful cooking in him, my lovely lass. Rhea shook her head at him, but there was an affectionate smile on her face. Derek looked down at his soup and away from the exchange. He couldn't help but wonder if he had someone to smile at like that. Who was he leaving behind? No matter how he struggled to try to remember, no familiar face came to mind. He couldn't remember any sweet smile or tender glance. He wondered if he should feel guilty for forgetting someone, or if there was no one to forget. He blew out a long breath and managed another bite of the delicious soup. He could at least distract himself for the moment and hope that he would remember something soon. He slowly ate, feeling the pleasant warmth fill him, and a little strength return despite his drowsiness. Even though he had already eaten the bread and the rest of the chicken soup, he could feel his appetite growing. "Did I not tell you that her cooking was a work of magic?" Halen rumbled proudly as Derek wiped the bowl with a small piece of bread to get the rest of the soup at the bottom. Rhea raised an eyebrow at him before turning back to the pot. "You got a little bit of brown there on the side of your nose, love." Halen chuckled. "And she be feisty, too." "It's delicious," Dark agreed, deciding it best to avoid getting further involved in the conversation. He started to nod, but he found it hard to bring his head back up. He knew that this time he was going to faint. He had overexerted himself. "I told you he should be resting, Halen," Rhea exclaimed as Dark swayed dangerously in his chair. "He shouldn't have gotten out of bed." Dark tried to reassure her, but barely managed to say a word before falling. Halen and Rhea kept close care of Derek as his strength slowly returned. They could both see that being trapped in bed was driving him mad, but Rhea insisted that he rest for a few days more before being allowed to walk about. Finally, the terrifying woman consented to allowing him to help her with the lighter work to be done. He helped keep the ovens warm for Halen's baking, made sure that there was water to make the bread and keep the fires under control, and helped keep the house and bakery clean. Halen and Rhea watched as he regained his strength, and they could see his personality returning and emerging. Despite their arguments that he should be resting, he did what he could to earn his keep around their home. He was normally quiet and serious, but Halen found that he could come back with speed and wit in conversation when pressed, or when he felt the need to speak. Dark found that he was growing to like Halen and Rhea as well. They were the closest thing he had to a family since he still could not remember his past, and he felt at ease around them. He found himself being quiet around the two of them, not because he felt out of place, but because he liked to hear them. He liked working with Halen as he sang old songs from history and legend while they worked, or listening to Rhea chatter about things that needed done around the house. He found himself peering into any reflective surface he could find. He couldn't remember the look of his own face and tried to memorize every line and contour. Suddenly, even the simplest freckle became something remarkable. His hair was black like raven feathers, but his skin was milky pale. His features were fine and angular, and his cheekbones high on his face. His nose was unremarkable and fit in easily with the rest of his face, unlike those of some of the townspeople he'd seen. His eyes were deep and rounded, and their color was the purest ice blue. His black eyebrows were thin and highly arched, and his forehead was high and smooth. His bangs fell down across his face, almost to his eyes, but not quite. He looked so different from Halen and Rhea and even the other townspeople. This difference in appearance did nothing to make the other inhabitants of the little town feel more gracious or accepting. They looked at Dark still as the stranger, even as he began to help tend the garden and animals outside of Halen and Rhea's. If it weren't for their respectable standing amongst them, the townspeople probably would have driven the stranger from their midst. The miller eyed him with uncertainty when he came to pick up flour for the bakery, but he dealt with Dark politely enough out of respect for Halen. Even still, he ordered his daughter Aubrey to remain upstairs out of sight whenever Dark came. Aubrey still watched out of her window as the handsome stranger came and left. He let his black hair hang down freely around his face. His muscles were returning mighty and strong, although still somewhat weakened from the fever. They showed clearly through his shirt as he hefted the sacks of grain over his shoulder. Aubrey even caught a glimpse of his pure blue eyes. She felt her heart stir at the sight of him, but her father allowed her nowhere near him. Dark was unaware that Milburn the miller even had a daughter. He was surprised one day to be greeted by a young woman instead of Milburn when he came to pick up the flour. She was pretty in her own right, with wavy chestnut hair bound in a braid that came down to the small of her back, and skin the color of ripe wheat in the summer sunshine. Her eyes were a deep, pure brown that were too innocent and naive, her thoughts open to the world. Her form was graceful for a girl of her age, for Dark could see that she was obviously young, 16 or 17 at the most, with curves enough to notice but not overly generous. She wore a simple working dress of plain white linen under a smock that was covered in flour. She had rolled her sleeves to her elbow for easy movement, and Derek caught a glimpse of a dainty bare foot peeking out from under the hem of her skirt. "The usual order, sir?" Her voice was sweet and her smile charming. Dark felt uncomfortable. He didn't know who she was, but he thought it safe to assume she was Milburn's daughter. He did know that he was older than this girl and that her flirtations would not be approved by her father, nor any of the other townspeople for that matter. "Yes, thank you. I've not seen you before. Where is Milburn?" She gave him another coy smile as she began to tally up his order. "Father's back by the stream, straightening out a bent gear. I can help you." Derek took an unconscious step back as she sauntered closer, her brown eyes twinkling. His instincts told him that this was not a good place to be. She stood before him demurely, too close for Derek's liking, and gazed up at him with her round brown eyes. "I think Halen will be expecting me, lass," Derek said stiffly, unsure of what to do. This was not a good place for him to be at all. "Aubrey!" Derek let out a long, relieved breath as Milburn stormed in through the back doors. His face and hands were smudged with grease, but Derek could still see the red flush of anger beneath it. "You're neglecting your chores, aren't you? Upstairs!" Derek caught a disappointed look on Aubrey's face. She turned to her father, looking appropriately chagrined and thoroughly embarrassed, then left the room to go tend to her chores. Derek found himself taking another step back as the wrathful miller stormed towards him, standing close but not at all in a pleasant way. "My daughter's off limits to you, stranger!" Milburn practically seethed. Derek held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I meant no offense. She said that she knew Halen's usual order, and that you were otherwise occupied. You being absent from sight, I took it that she was telling the truth. Do not speak to her again!" He stormed back into the storeroom and returned with Halen's order, throwing it roughly at Derek's feet. "Get out!" Ticken, the blacksmith, was even less welcoming, watching Derek from within his forge. The fire cast strange, almost frightening shadows on his face. His brown eyes glared venomously at the stranger every time he strayed past the door to the forge. Sweat dripped down his face and wet his curly brown hair. His wiry muscles coiled and uncoiled under his thick, leathery skin with every stroke of his hammer against the cherry red metal on his anvil. With every beat, he thought of the stranger's leaving. Derek boded ill to him. He waited every day for Derek to leave town. His own wife, a pale, thin-lipped shrew with the compassion of her husband's hammer, distrusted Derek as well, though most of the rest of the townsfolk would agree that the blacksmith's wife was a foul, sneering harpy. They had begun to follow her in her habit of locking up any of their valuables since the stranger had come to town. Strangers meant no good for their town, especially when they arrived on the verge of a storm, like Dark did. Their son, Keegan, disliked the stranger as well, but for his own reasons that he had not shared with his parents. He had inherited more of his father's looks than his mother's, fortunately for him, but he had inherited her temperament. He saw how Aubrey, the miller's daughter, watched the stranger and he resented it. Every day, envy grew within him as he stared after Dark like a moonstruck calf. The day before Dark had arrived, Keegan had approached Milburn, Aubrey's father, about marrying her. Milburn was known to the town for his overprotectiveness of his daughter, and it had been difficult enough to even enter into negotiation for her. Now, with the stranger's prolonged stay and his advances on Aubrey the day before, it was doubtful the miller would allow any of the proceedings to go on for fear of any trouble. Keegan fumed as he aided his father in the smithy. The entire town had heard the story of the miller walking in on the stranger smooth-talking his daughter. He had her back against the wall, his arms almost around her, whispering things that were shameful for a girl her age to hear. If Milburn hadn't interrupted, it was likely that Aubrey would have been unfit for marriage to anyone but the stranger. Keegan felt sick at the thought. Aubrey was fair and beautiful, and he had cared for her since they were young. She had never taken notice of him before, and now she was ready to give her maidenhood to this stranger? The very notion was appalling. Keegan knew that he would have to do something about it. Whether or not the other townspeople feared to disrespect Halen and Rhea, he would make their feelings known. He would be their champion to drive the stranger from their midst. He would win Aubrey's favor, showing her how weak the stranger really was. With every passing day, he thought more and more of driving the stranger out. He only had to wait for the right time to make his move. Dark was aware of the townspeople's mistrust of him, but he carried on ignorant of their individual misgivings and of the rumor that had now spread about his encounter with Aubrey. Day by day, he was able to do more and more, yet his memory had not returned. Night by night, he heard a strange and eerie howling from somewhere in the hills surrounding the town. Some nights, though, he tried to convince himself that it was only the tricks of his strange dreams. He thought he saw a great hulking creature prowl past his window. He felt as if something was watching him at times during the night, but only once had he thought he caught great brown eyes staring before they had vanished. He still had no knowledge of who he was or where he had come from, though he was beginning already to put together clues from habits that he found himself engaging in, or even from his appearance. He took off his shirt one night for bed. He stopped at the sight of the scars covering his chest and stomach. Some were long and ragged, feeling raised from his skin against his fingertips. Others were smaller and paler, still just as distinct as the others for the fact that they gave his skin an almost silver appearance in those places. He twisted to look over his shoulder at his back. What he could see was covered in more scars. He reached and felt his lower back and found still more. He felt his mouth go dry and his heart pound. What had he done that he had earned so many wounds? Oftentimes people strive to forget such things, Rhea said from behind him. He whirled around to face her. Startled, this was the second time that she had caught him undressed. She nodded towards his scars. You try to remember. Perhaps there's a reason you don't. I need to know who I am, Derek answered, straightening up. His muscles were now strong and back at his command, and he relished the feeling. I need to know who I was. He looked away slightly. Who I might be leaving behind. Rhea tilted her head to the side and smiled sympathetically. Perhaps it's better that you don't. The mind often hides what we do not wish to see to protect us. I should not need protecting, Dark answered. He could feel that he was strong. Looking at the scars on his body, he felt safe to guess that he had survived many fights. He needed to know what his life had been like, what he had been like. Had he been a good man? He had learned some of what being a good man meant from working with Halen. A good man strove to be honest, to help and care for his neighbors, to provide for his family. In their dealings with other people of the town, he had never caught Halen in a lie or trying to cheat someone out of what they were due. Often he was over-generous and gave extra helpings for free, or sweet treats to the few children that Dark had seen. Had he been a man like that? Or had he cheated and lied? Had he been a thief, or worse? Or were his scars left over from whatever his trade had been? What kind of trade could leave such marks other than that of a soldier, a bodyguard, or a thief? Rhea looked pointedly at the scars. Looks to me like you do. Before he could reply, she shoved a bundle of clothes at him. Halen says to give you these as thanks for your help in the bakery. You are welcome in our home as long as you wish to stay. She turned and left the room, leaving him standing, staring after her. There were nights that he dreamt of her. Those nights were his favorite, the ones touched by her gentle beauty rather than the blood and screams of his nightmares. There was an ache growing in his chest when he watched Rhea walk away, a pain that traveled down into his gut. He knew he should not have such thoughts, especially not about another's wife. Darek shook his head, running his fingers through his hair and taking a deep breath. There were times he had a feeling that they knew more than they were telling him. Did they know more about his past than they were letting on? Or was he just grasping at straws? He set the new clothes down and slid into bed. It was a long while before he could finally manage to fall asleep. He stared at the dark ceiling above him as if it could reveal the answer he was seeking. A cold breeze drifted through the open window and he shivered, pulling the covers up higher over his head. Feeling another unnerving sense that he was being watched, he turned to his window. He squinted as he thought he caught the glimpse of something trotting away in the dark, but again it was gone before he could be sure that he had even seen it. Unsettled, he returned to his former thoughts and tried to push the strange sighting out of his mind. Who was he? The most disturbing question was, did he want to know? What if he didn't like what he had been? Could he live with deeds that he didn't remember? Perhaps this forgetfulness was a blessing. Maybe it was his second chance at life. But what if he had been a good man? What if he was giving up a good life, even better than the one he was living now? How could he know? Troubled by heavy thoughts, but too tired to ponder them any longer, he felt his eyelids slowly begin to close. That night, his dreams were far darker than since he had first woken from his fever. Stone walls flashed in front of him, pale people without faces ghosted past. Through it all, a voice whispered a name that he couldn't hear. The more he listened, the quieter it grew until it disappeared into the dark. He woke with a jolt. He strained to hear anything in the dark room, as if he could hear the voice better awake. He felt the rush of anger and the stab of bitter disappointment. He had been so close, and yet it had slipped out of his grasp. But to what had he been close to? Darek rose with a scowl. The light of the new day had just crept over the horizon, barely enough to see by. He dressed hurriedly, pausing again to look at his scars and ponder what they meant about his former life, and crept out of the house to the stable. The air was cold and brisk in the early morning, but he had learned that it would be warm later on as the sun rose higher. The blasted red clay dust plumed up with every step and covered his boots and pants. If there was one thing other than his lost memory that would drive him mad, it was the infernal red clay dust of this town. It was inescapable. No matter how many times he washed his clothes, nor how hard he scrubbed, there was no being rid of the stuff. Rhea found his struggles with the washing amusing. For some reason, the dust bothered him more than he cared to tell her. It looked too much like the red stain of blood. The warm smell of horses and hay reached his nose as he opened the barn doors and left them slightly ajar. This was one of the places he enjoyed working the most when he helped Rhea and Halen with chores. Mucking the stalls, as unpleasant as the job was, had helped him regain much of the strength in his arms. He also enjoyed washing the horses down, feeding them, and turning them out into the small pasture behind the bakery. There were only 3 horses, the 2 cart horses that Halen kept, and Darek's own horse. He had visited his horse since he had woken and had the strength to walk, but he hadn't dared risk riding for fear of falling. The horse that they claimed was his was a magnificent beast. It It was a snowy white stallion with a flowing mane and tail that had a gossamer sheen. The stallion whickered affectionately at him, greeting. He rubbed the horse's neck in return. Halen had said that he should give the poor beast a name again, but Darek loathed the thought. After suffering through losing his own name, he didn't want to give the beast a second name and have to train him to answer it too. The horse whinnied softly and nudged his shoulder with his nose. "You know who I am, don't you?" he asked. The stallion snorted and tossed his head. "Yeah, you do. I wish you could tell me. You look like more than the average farm horse. You look like you belong in the stable of a king." Dark stroked the horse's neck. "I wish I knew the same for you. Maybe then I'd have a clue about myself." Without any more thought, Darek reached for the tack hanging on the side of the stall and saddled the stallion. He took a deep breath and mustered his courage before swinging up into the saddle. The stallion pranced eagerly as he adjusted the saddle, knowing that he was about to go out with his master for the first time in weeks. Darek felt himself begin to smile as he realized how comfortable he was in the saddle. He had feared that he would not remember how to handle the beast, but those fears were fading quickly with every passing second. He walked the stallion slowly out of the stall. His body was moving naturally with the sway of the horse's gait. The stallion nosed the barn doors open enough for him to pass through. Darek nudged the horse into a trot, again finding himself moving easily with the horse. "Let's see what we can do," Darek urged. The horse half reared in anticipation, and then it felt like they were flying. The white stallion surged forward, sending clots of dirt and dust up from under his hooves. Their surroundings passed by in the blink of an eye. The earth was but a blur beneath them. Darek moved lower to the stallion's neck, rising up in the saddle. The stallion pushed forward even faster. Darek steered him through the open plains surrounding the town, and he wheeled him in tight turns and backed up, leaping over the remnants of fences and old stones. The stallion was a sight to behold, and Darek felt more at home in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. He found his right hand feeling empty, and his left hand gripping the reins tighter, and he had the haunting feeling that he was still missing something. He tugged on the reins, and the stallion veered sharply to the right, galloping up over a small hill. When they reached the top, Darek reined the stallion to a halt. The stallion reared and neighed proudly. He froze, his heart stopping as a massive creature stood on a knoll some 20 yards distant. It had the body of a wolf, but its size was all wrong. Darek was sure that if he stood near it, he would only come up to the elbow joint of its front leg. Its fur was shaggy and tan with burgundy stripes on the sides, as if it had been slashed with some tremendous claws. It met his eyes and stared back at him with knowing, terrifyingly brown eyes. It lowered its eyes meaningfully to the ground in front of him before it turned and disappeared in the hillock. He stared after it for a moment, scarcely believing what he had seen, before he looked in the direction that it had. Beneath him, broken bodies were strewn across the ground. Their bloody armor glittered and shone in the light of the small fires burning here and there, lit from the fall of flaming arrows. The stench of decay was almost overwhelming. A voice shouted something that he couldn't comprehend, a name that was lost amongst the sounds of men dying. His name. Darek blinked, and suddenly there was nothing but grass and dust in the field beneath him. The stallion's forelegs met the earth again and pranced as he awaited his master's command. Darek stared at the field, unable to comprehend what he had just seen. In his mind's eye, he could still see the bodies of the men, but there were none there. There were no moans of the dying. There was only the sound of the wind rustling the grass and the cricket saying farewell to the last of the night. Disturbed by what he had just seen, Darek wheeled the stallion around and urged him into a gallop back to town. His mind was swirling with questions. What was he remembering? Was this what his life had been like? Had he been a soldier? Where was the place that he had seen? Had he stumbled upon it by accident, or had he been searching for whatever battle was held there? Halen was waiting outside the barn when Dark returned. He was leaning against the doors with a smug smile as he watched Dark trot back into town. "You look like you were born in the saddle," he said as Dark reined the stallion to a stop. Halen nodded at the horse. "You thought of a name yet?" Dark leaned down and patted the stallion's neck. "Saval does not need to be renamed." Halen's eyes widened. Dark felt himself go cold. He had not named the horse. He had remembered the stallion's name. Saval snorted and tossed his head as if to say that he was right. "You remembered?" Halen said in wonder. He reached to stroke Saval's mane. "How?" "I don't know," Dark replied. He sighed as the stallion nuzzled at his cheek. "But I know that is his name." "Perhaps that will give you hope as to your own name," Halen said. He cleared his throat. "In the meantime, if you desire to remain here as you have, I'll be needing help in the bakery today." Dark nodded in acquiescence. "Of course. I would never think to accept your hospitality without repaying you. You've done much for me." Halen patted Derek's leg. "You're a good man, Derek. Maybe you don't need to try to remember. You seem to be doing just fine now." Halen looked up at Dark for a moment, for all the world seeming like he was about to tell him something, or he was waiting for something. He grunted for a final note and then turned back towards the house. Dark leaned back in the saddle and watched him for a moment. He blew out a long breath and dismounted, leading Saval into the barn. Dark was grateful to Halen, but he didn't know if the baker was right. The glimpse of the slaughter that he had seen and the scars on his body made him wonder if he was truly as good of a man as Halen had said. "Maybe next time we go for a ride, you can tell me my name." Dark sighed to Saval as he unsaddled the stallion and brushed him down. Thank you, kind traveler, for listening to this chapter of Red Clay Dust by my friend Katherine. Her socials will be linked in the description below, and please like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, safe travels.